Welcome back to this video blog series. This is the third video in the series, so if you haven't seen the first two videos, you might want to go back and watch those two first before continuing with this one. You'll remember that we ended our last video with the question: how can lowly humanity accomplish perfection? I ended by arguing that we need to start our conversation about human nature with Genesis 1 and 2 as opposed to Genesis 3. In other words, we need to consider how and why humans were created rather than the opposite, which is sin. It's the fall into sin that Adam and Eve experience in Genesis chapter 3. For Gregory of Nyssa, becoming a Christian is nothing short of being brought into participation in the life of Christ. So it's crucial that we figure out how this can even be possible. And this leads us into a conversation about the nature of humanity. Is our nature good or evil? Or is it something more ambiguous? And Gregory wants us to think about this problem by looking to Genesis 1 and 2 to tell us about what God's intentions were in creating. So he acknowledges the seemingly absurd claim that we could be like the divine. He also states that this is exactly what Christianity is. Christianity is an imitation of the divine nature. He goes on to denounce that claim that this exceeds the lowliness of our human nature. And here's why. Genesis 1 and 2 says that God created human beings in the image of God. This means that the claim of Christianity is that in following Christ and being brought into the union with God, we are brought back to our original good that God had intended in the beginning. It's redemption. The goal is the restoration of the image of God for Gregory. Gregory points to this as our understanding of human nature, saying humans come to Genesis to become partakers and participators in divine good things. Now, in the last video, I talked about our tendency to mix up our understanding of human nature with the human problem. You'll remember I called this worm theology. Now, I want to be sure that I'm not misunderstood here as saying that sin is no big deal. There's not something that we really have to be concerned about, and that human beings aren't in a predicament because of it. Neither I nor Gregory are saying that. The point is simply that sin is not our nature. It is the distortion of our nature. Here's how Gregory explains it. Human nature is worthy and capable of union with God, but in our free will, we fall from this worthiness. He says it's like somebody who slips and falls into the mud. They come out so filthy that even their best friends and family don't recognize them. Here's what I find so important about this explanation. It holds an important tension of saying that human nature is good. But there's also a problem for us. Because I don't want to be misheard, and I don't want Gregory to be misheard. We're not saying that, this is a high view of human nature, right? But we're not saying that sin isn't a problem. Actually, Gregory is adamant that achieving this freedom from sin is quite an undertaking. And now is when we really start to get into the meaning of Christian perfection. I think Gregory is especially going to be helpful for those who are intimidated by that language of perfection, which some have claimed means that we become completely without sin or mistake. The language of perfection and holiness, it may cause us to believe that we reach something. We reach it and we're done. For instance, the term entire sanctification, which comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:23, it may lead us to think that once we've received entire sanctification, we are completely done growing. We have nothing left to accomplish in our relationship with God. And this makes sense when you think about the literal definition of perfection. Something that is perfect, it lacks nothing that it should have. There's boundaries to it. If something's perfect, it has everything it needs. Now, Gregory is aware of this problem using the language of perfection, but for him, it creates this really needed tension. For Gregory, we can't think about Christian perfection in the same way that we think about the language of perfection, This is primarily because Christian perfection is about being like Christ. To be like Christ is to share in the life of Christ, as we talked about in the last video. This really means that we are sharing in the virtues of Christ. Now, Gregory explains that when we talk about virtue, the only limit to virtue is that it has no limit. Oxymoron, right? He points to the way that Paul talks about it in Philippians 3:13. We are ever running the course of virtue, never ceased straining towards those things that are still to come, looking to what is ahead, forgetting what is behind. Gregory explains that goodness cannot have an end except the end that is its opposite, that is evil. The way I picture it is like we're walking up an escalator that's moving down. If you stop moving, you'll be carried downward. Our life is a journey. It's a race. If we stop running the race, we begin to lose. He says the stopping in the race of virtue marks the beginning of the race of evil. Now, this makes perfect sense if we think about the very nature of the divine. See, we say of God that God is perfect, right? Well, we also say that God is infinite. God has no boundaries. Here our understanding of perfection begins to become much more spiritual and even divine and mystical. So Gregory goes on to admit that it actually is impossible to attain perfection. But this is only because perfection cannot be attained. It's eternal and limitless. Perfection is not something for us to attain. It is something for us to live into. It is something that we are invited to share in. Humans are always changing. That is unavoidable. But this is a good thing, and it's in our nature. Gregory says, don't worry if you see in your nature a desire for change. Changing in everything for the better, we exchange glory for glory. This is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians. And he continues, in this way we become greater through daily increase, becoming ever more and more and more perfect, and never arriving too quickly to the limit. Humans change. Humans have desire. What Gregory wants is for us to not distort our nature further by banishing change or banishing our desire. We must instead have our change and our desire directed towards the Creator. Now, I know that many of you may be getting nervous. We've talked a lot about attaining perfection, as if it's something that we as individuals can do. But fear not, this is going to be addressed, but not yet. In our next video, we're going to talk about the book of the Bible on human perfection. I think you're going to be surprised at which book of the Bible it is. So I hope you'll join me for that video.